Have you ever felt like God is trying to speak to you but you're not sure how to hear His voice? Maybe you've prayed, begged for answers, but all you're met with is silence. Or perhaps you feel something stirring deep inside you, an unshakable feeling that Jesus is asking you something important, but you don't know what it is. The truth is, Jesus often speaks to us through questions. He doesn't just give answers. He leads us to discover them for ourselves. In the Bible, every time He asked someone a question, it wasn't because He needed an answer, it was because He wanted them to reflect, to look deeper, to unlock a greater truth about their faith. And right now, He is doing the same with you. Think about it. When was the last time you truly stopped everything and asked yourself, what is Jesus asking me today? We are so used to praying, asking God for things, seeking guidance, requesting miracles. But how often do we stop to listen? How often do we take a moment to truly engage in a conversation with Jesus rather than just listing our needs? Many times when we pray, we focus on what we need. Lord, bless me. Lord, help me. Lord, open doors for me. But what if instead of just seeking answers, you started paying attention to the questions God is placing on your heart? In the Gospels, Jesus asked powerful, life-changing questions. Do you believe I am able to do this? Matthew 9:28. Why are you afraid? Matthew 8:26. Who do you say that I am? Matthew 16:15. Each of these questions forced the people around Him to confront their faith, their doubts, their fears. And today, He is still asking questions that can reshape your life, deepen your faith, and bring you closer to His divine purpose. But here's the challenge. Most people ignore these questions. They're too busy, distracted, caught up in daily struggles. They want miracles, but they don't want reflection. They want breakthroughs, but they avoid the deeper conversations God is trying to have with them. And that's why you're here. That's why this message reached you. Because there is something Jesus wants to ask you right now. And if you take the time to listen, to truly open your heart, you might just receive the answer you've been searching for all along. That's why I want to invite you to do something right now. Take a moment and reflect. What is Jesus asking you today? What is the question He is placing in your heart? Leave your prayer request in the comments below. Because today, we are going to pray together. We are going to seek His voice, not just with our words, but with open hearts, ready to listen. Prayer is not just about speaking, it's about connection. It's about creating space for God to reveal His purpose, His direction, and His love in our lives. So if you're feeling lost, if you need clarity, if you've been waiting for a sign, this is your moment. Let's pray together and believe that Jesus will reveal what He wants to say to you. And before we go deeper, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss any messages that strengthen your faith and bring you closer to God's plan for your life. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's open our hearts and dive into what Jesus is truly asking you today. The question that can change everything. There are moments in life when everything seems to pause, when the noise of the world fades just enough for us to feel something stirring deep inside. It's in these moments, whether in silence, in hardship, or in unexpected blessings, that Jesus asks us something. A question that isn't just meant to be heard, but to be answered. A question that has the power to change everything. But here's the thing. Most people don't realize when Jesus is speaking. They assume that divine communication only happens through thunderous signs, miraculous visions, or audible voices from the heavens. Yet, the truth is, Jesus speaks in ways that are much more personal, much more intimate. Sometimes it's through Scripture. Other times it's through a situation in your life. And more often than not, it's through a question that lingers in your heart, refusing to leave, waiting for you to respond. What if, at this very moment, He is asking you something? What if there is a question hovering over your spirit, shaping the direction of your life without you even realizing it? What if Jesus is standing before you, not with an answer, but with a question that demands everything from you? Would you recognize it? And more importantly, would you have the courage to answer? The Bible is filled with moments where Jesus asked people questions that changed their destinies, not because He needed information, but because He wanted them to realize something about themselves, their faith, and their purpose. When He looked at the blind men who cried out for mercy, He asked, "Do you believe I am able to do this?" Matthew 9:28. When He saw His disciples filled with fear in the middle of the storm, He asked, "Why are you afraid?" Matthew 8:26. And when Peter stood before him full of passion yet prone to failure, Jesus looked him in the eyes and asked, "Do you love me?" John 21:16. Each question was a mirror, a door, a turning point, and the way they answered changed everything. Now, think about your life. Think about the struggles, the prayers, the waiting. Could it be that Jesus is not just giving you answers but asking you something? Could it be that the breakthrough you've been waiting for starts with you facing his question head on? Maybe it's, "Do you trust me?" Maybe it's, "Why are you still holding on to this?" Maybe it's, "What do you truly want?" Many people ignore these questions. They keep running, distracting themselves with routine, with responsibilities, with anything that prevents them from confronting what Jesus is truly asking. But the reality is, ignoring his question won't make it go away. It will only delay the transformation that he wants to bring into your life. Because when Jesus asks, it's never to confuse or condemn. It's to lead you into a deeper revelation of who you are and what he is calling you to be. So here's the challenge. Stop for a moment. Listen. Reflect. What is Jesus asking you today? Because when you find the courage to answer, you may realize that your life is about to change in ways you never imagined. And if this is stirring something inside you, if you feel like this message is speaking directly to your heart, then this is your moment to engage. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I am ready to listen." Let's declare it together. The unexpected questions of Jesus. If Jesus stood before you right now, what would he ask? Not what you want him to ask, not what you expect, but what he knows will uncover the truth hidden inside you. That's what he always did. His questions weren't simple. They weren't small talk. They were sharp, precise, piercing through excuses and self-deception like a sword. They weren't designed to give easy answers, but to awaken something inside of people, to bring light to places they had kept in the dark. When Jesus asked, "Do you want to be healed?" to a man who had been suffering for 38 years, it seemed like a strange question. Of course he wanted to be healed. Why else would he be lying by the pool of Bethesda, waiting for a miracle? But Jesus was not just asking about his body. He was asking about his heart, about his will, about his readiness to let go of the identity of suffering he had carried for so long. Because healing is not just about physical restoration, it's about transformation. It's about stepping into a new life. And sometimes people cling so tightly to their pain, their limitations, their past, that they don't even realize they are resisting the very thing they've been praying for. Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" to his disciples. And that question wasn't about theology or intellectual understanding. It was personal. It forced them to decide, to take a stand, to commit. Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And in that moment, everything shifted. Because once you declare who Jesus is in your life, once you recognize his authority, his power, and his presence, you can no longer live the same way. But what if Peter had stayed silent? What if he had hesitated? What if he had ignored the question? How many times do we do the same? How often does Jesus ask us something deep, something life-altering, and we brush it off, pretend we didn't hear, keep moving as if nothing happened? And then there's the moment when Jesus looks at a desperate father and asks, "Do you believe?" The man had come begging for his child's healing, pleading for a miracle, and yet Jesus turned it around, placing the weight of the moment back on him. Faith was not just about what Jesus could do. It was about what this father was willing to believe. And in one of the most honest, raw, human responses in the Bible, the man says, "I believe, help my unbelief." That moment is a mirror for all of us. Because faith is rarely perfect. It wavers, it trembles, it struggles against fear and doubt. But Jesus wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for willingness, for honesty, for someone who, even in their uncertainty, was willing to say, "I trust you." Maybe right now, Jesus is asking you something you weren't expecting. Maybe it's not the comforting words or clear directions you were hoping for. Maybe it's a question that challenges you, that unsettles you, that forces you to look at your own heart in a way you've been avoiding. Maybe he's asking, "Why do you doubt?" Or, "What are you still afraid of?" Or, "What is truly holding you back?" And maybe, just maybe, answering that question is the key to everything you've been searching for. But the truth is, most people avoid these moments. They pray, they ask for guidance, but when God speaks back, especially when he speaks through a question, they hesitate. They distract themselves. They convince themselves it wasn't really God, or that it's not the right time, or that they'll deal with it later. But what if later never comes? What if today is the moment to face it, to listen, to respond? Because when Jesus asks you something, it's never to condemn. It's to awaken, to transform, to lead you to something greater. And now I want you to think deeply about this. What is the question Jesus is asking you right now? What is he stirring in your heart that you've been too afraid to face? Take a moment, close your eyes, and let it come to the surface. And when you feel that tug inside you, I want you to declare it. Write in the comments, Jesus, I will not ignore your question. Let's take this step together, the power behind his questions. When Jesus asked a question, it was never just words. It was never small talk, never a casual inquiry. His words carried weight. They penetrated the deepest corners of the soul. They shook people to their core. Because Jesus didn't just ask for the sake of asking. He asked to reveal, to expose, to transform. His questions weren't there to make people comfortable. They were designed to confront, to challenge, to force a decision. And the moment someone truly answered him, their life was never the same. Think about the rich young ruler. He came to Jesus with confidence, seeking the secret to eternal life. He had followed the commandments, lived a righteous life, done everything he thought was required of him. But Jesus looked at him, saw straight through his external perfection, past the mask of religious obedience, and asked him something that cut straight to his heart. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. And then the real test came. Go, sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. In that moment, the man's faith, his devotion, his very identity was put to the test, and he walked away, not because he didn't love God, not because he didn't want eternal life, but because he wasn't willing to confront what Jesus had exposed. That's what his questions do. They bring to light what we try to keep in the shadows. They strip away the things we tell ourselves to feel secure. They show us the real battle inside of us, the thing we avoid, the thing we don't want to give up, the thing we pretend isn't holding us back. And right now, that's exactly what he is doing with you. Maybe you've been praying, waiting for an answer, asking for direction, and instead of giving you a solution, Jesus is giving you a question. Maybe he's asking, are you really ready to change? Or, do you trust me enough to let go? Or, what are you still afraid of? And maybe that question makes you uncomfortable. Maybe you don't want to answer it. Maybe, like the rich young ruler, part of you would rather walk away than face what it reveals. But that's exactly why his questions are so powerful. Because they don't just inform, they transform. When Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? He wasn't just looking for words. He was leading Peter to restoration, to healing, to purpose. Peter had denied him 3 times, had wept in shame, had probably believed he had ruined everything. But Jesus didn't condemn him, didn't lecture him, didn't remind him of his failure. He simply asked, again and again, do you love me? Because the answer wasn't for Jesus. It was for Peter. It was a question that lifted Peter from his past, redefined his future, and set him back on the path God had prepared for him. And that's the thing. Jesus doesn't ask to push you away. He asks to bring you closer. He asks to show you the chains you didn't even realize you were carrying. He asks to reveal the fear that has been making your decisions for you. He asks to pull you into a faith that is deeper, stronger, unshakable. But he will never force you to answer. That choice is yours. You can ignore it. You can pretend you didn't hear. You can convince yourself that it's not the right time. But the question will remain, waiting, until you are ready to face it. And now, I need you to think. What is the question Jesus has been asking you? What is the thing he has been pressing on your heart? You don't have to figure it all out today. You don't need to have every answer. But you do need to take the first step. Write in the comments, Jesus, I am ready to listen. Declare it. Step into it. This is your moment. What is Jesus asking you today? There's a moment in every person's life when God interrupts their routine, their expectations, their carefully laid out plans, and places a question so profound in their heart that it refuses to be ignored. It's not always loud. It doesn't always come with thunder or visions or undeniable signs. Sometimes it's just a quiet stirring, a persistent thought, a whisper in the depths of your soul that won't go away. But make no mistake, when Jesus asks, he expects an answer, and the way you respond can shift the entire direction of your life. Maybe right now, Jesus is asking you, do you trust me? That's a question that sounds simple on the surface, but when you truly let it sink in, it becomes one of the most challenging things to answer. Because trust isn't tested in easy moments. Trust is tested in uncertainty. Trust is tested when you don't see a way out, when prayers seem to go unanswered, when doors close, when the silence feels unbearable. It's easy to say, "I trust you, Lord," when life is comfortable, when everything is falling into place. But when the storm comes, when you're standing at the edge of the unknown, when you're forced to take a step forward without seeing the ground beneath you, that's when this question becomes real. Or maybe Jesus is asking you, why are you afraid? Fear is a thief. It steals opportunities, it paralyzes dreams, it drowns out faith. Fear makes you hesitate when you should move. It makes you retreat when you should advance. And most of the time, the thing we fear isn't even the worst-case scenario. It's the possibility of change. It's the idea of stepping into something unfamiliar, of losing control, of not knowing what happens next. Fear whispers lies that make us settle for less than what God has planned. It convinces us that staying where we are is safer than trusting Him for something greater. But Jesus doesn't operate within fear. His kingdom is built on bold faith, on stepping out of the boat, on walking into the unknown because you believe that what He has for you is better than anything you could build for yourself. Or maybe the question Jesus is asking you is even more direct. What do you truly want? This is a question He asked blind Bartimaeus before healing him, as if the answer wasn't obvious. But Jesus never assumes. He wants you to speak it. He wants you to know what you are asking for, to confront your desires, to verbalize what you are truly seeking. Sometimes we don't even know what we want because we've spent so long listening to what the world tells us we should want. Success, security, approval, comfort. But deep down, what is your soul actually crying out for? What is the one thing that if you were to be honest with yourself, you would admit you need more than anything else? Is it peace? Is it restoration? Is it purpose? Is it to finally let go of something that has weighed you down for far too long? Jesus isn't just asking for the sake of asking. He's leading you to the root of it all. He's bringing you face to face with the deepest cries of your heart. And yet so many people hesitate to answer. They hear the question, they feel the pull in their spirit, but instead of responding, they push it aside. They get distracted. They convince themselves it's not the right time, that they need to figure things out first, that maybe later, when life is less chaotic, they'll have time to really think about it. But the truth is, delaying your answer doesn't erase the question. It only postpones the breakthrough that comes with responding. Jesus never forces an answer. He waits. He waits because real faith, real transformation can only come from willingness. So now, the question is in front of you. What is Jesus asking you today? What has He been pressing on your heart, stirring in your spirit, making impossible to ignore? It's time to face it, to name it, to step into it. And I want you to take action right now. Write in the comments, Jesus, I will not ignore your voice. Let this be your declaration. This is your moment to step forward. How your answer shapes your destiny. Everything in your life up until this moment has been leading you to this question. Every struggle, every victory, every silent prayer whispered in the dark, every tear that fell when no one was watching. Jesus isn't asking you just for the sake of conversation. He is asking because your answer holds the power to shape your future. When Jesus asks, "Do you trust me?" Or, "Why are you afraid?" Or, "What do you truly want?" He isn't just testing your faith. He is preparing you for what comes next. Because the way you respond to His question determines what doors open before you, what chains break off of you, and what direction your life takes from this point forward. Look at the stories in Scripture. Every time someone answered Jesus, their destiny shifted. When Peter declared for, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he wasn't just saying words, he was stepping into his calling, into his identity, into a role so great that Jesus Himself said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." But what if Peter had hesitated? What if he had remained silent, unsure, waiting for more confirmation? How many times do we do the same? How often do we feel God prompting us, calling us, asking us to step forward, but instead of answering, we pause, we hesitate, we wait, as if waiting will make the question go away, as if time will somehow change what God has already placed inside of us. But silence is an answer too. Hesitation is a decision. And delaying obedience can cost us the very thing we are praying for. Think about Bartimaeus, the blind man crying out on the side of the road. When Jesus finally stopped and called him forward, He didn't immediately heal him. Instead, he asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" It seems obvious, doesn't it? The man was blind. Of course he wanted to see. But Jesus still asked, because healing requires agreement. Change requires participation. Transformation demands acknowledgement. And Bartimaeus didn't hesitate. He declared it boldly, "Lord, I want to see." And because he answered with faith, his entire life changed in an instant. Now think about the rich young ruler. He also had an encounter with Jesus. He also received a question, but his answer led him in a different direction. When Jesus asked him to give up his wealth and follow him, the young man's face fell. He wanted eternal life. He wanted to be close to God, but he wasn't ready to pay the price. So he walked away. He had the chance for transformation, but his own answer kept him stuck in the life he had always known. And that's the reality. Not everyone answers Jesus with faith. Not everyone says yes. Not everyone is willing to step into what he is offering. Some walk away. Some stay stuck. Some choose comfort over calling. And that is why this moment is so important. Because right now, Jesus is asking you something, and the way you answer will shape your journey from here. Maybe he is asking you to trust him in a way you never have before. Maybe he is asking you to let go of something you've been holding on to for too long. Maybe he is calling you into something greater, but you're afraid of what it might cost. Whatever it is, this is your moment of decision. Will you answer with faith, or will you walk away like the rich young ruler, holding on to the very thing that is keeping you from your destiny? You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to know every detail of what comes next. You just have to take the first step. And I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I choose faith." This is your moment to say yes. The cost of ignoring it. Every time Jesus asks a question, there are only two possible responses: obedience or avoidance, faith or hesitation, movement or stagnation. There is no neutral ground because even silence is an answer, and that is where most people find themselves. Not in outright rejection, but in quiet resistance. Not in denying God, but in delaying him, convincing themselves that the time isn't right, that they need more confirmation, that they'll deal with it later. But later is a dangerous word when it comes to the voice of Jesus. Later has stolen more destinies than failure ever has. Later has kept people stuck in cycles of doubt, fear, and complacency for years. Later has silenced callings, buried dreams, and prevented breakthroughs. Because the truth is, delaying what God is asking from you is no different than rejecting it. The rich young ruler didn't argue with Jesus. He didn't deny his words or fight back. He simply walked away. And that is exactly what so many people do when confronted with the hard questions of faith. They walk away. Not always physically, but spiritually, emotionally. They stop seeking. They avoid reflection. They distract themselves with busyness and noise so they don't have to deal with what Jesus is really pressing on their hearts. But the question doesn't disappear. It lingers, waiting for the moment they are ready to face it. Some people take years. Some take a lifetime. Some never return to answer. And that is the true cost of ignoring Jesus. It's not that he stops speaking, but that our hearts grow numb to his voice. Think about the people in the Bible who had encounters with Jesus but refused to respond. The Pharisees had him standing right in front of them, heard his teachings with their own ears, witnessed miracles, saw prophecies fulfilled, and yet they remained blind. Not because the truth wasn't clear, but because they refused to open their hearts to it. They had all the knowledge, all the religious training, all the scripture, yet when confronted with Jesus himself, they ignored the question that could have changed everything. Who do you say that I am? And because they refused to answer, they missed the very thing they had been waiting for their entire lives. And then there was Judas. He followed Jesus, walked with him, heard his words, saw his power firsthand. And yet, when the time came for him to truly answer, he chose betrayal. Not because he didn't believe, but because his heart was divided. He wanted Jesus, but he also wanted control. He wanted the kingdom, but he also wanted security. And so instead of fully surrendering, he compromised. He tried to hold on to both, but in the end, he lost everything. The cost of ignoring Jesus is never immediate. It doesn't come in a single moment of punishment or judgment. It comes in the slow erosion of clarity, in the quiet drift away from his presence, in the way the fire that once burned bright begins to fade into indifference. It comes in the missed opportunities, the doors that could have been opened, the life that could have been lived in the fullness of his calling. It comes in the regret of looking back and realizing that the thing he was asking of you was never meant to take something away, but to give you something greater. So now, you have a choice. Jesus is asking you something right now. He is pressing on your heart, stirring something deep inside you that you cannot ignore. You can either answer with faith, or you can turn away. You can step into what he is calling you toward, or you can let fear, doubt, and hesitation keep you stuck. But whatever you do, do not let this moment pass you by. Do not let later be your answer. Do not be like the rich young ruler who walked away, or the Pharisees who remained blind, or Judas who tried to hold on to both sides and lost it all. This is your moment to respond. This is your moment to step forward, and I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I choose to follow you." Let this be the day you say yes. Recognizing his voice in your life. One of the greatest struggles people face is not that they don't want to follow Jesus, but that they don't know how to recognize his voice. They wonder if it's really him speaking, if the thoughts in their heart are truly from God or just their own imagination. They pray, they wait, they hope for clarity, but sometimes the silence feels overwhelming. And that's when doubt begins to creep in, whispering, "What if you're wrong? What if you're just making this up? What if this isn't really God?" But here's the truth. Jesus is always speaking. The problem is never that he is silent. The problem is that we are surrounded by so much noise that we fail to hear him. God doesn't just speak in the ways we expect. He doesn't always come with a thunderous voice from heaven or through dramatic miracles. Sometimes he speaks through scripture, where a verse you've read 100 times suddenly takes on a new meaning, cutting straight to the core of what you're going through. Other times he speaks through people, through a sermon, a conversation, a friend who says something that hits you so deeply that you know it wasn't just coincidence. And then there are the moments where he speaks through circumstances, when everything around you seems to be pointing in one direction, aligning in ways you never could have planned on your own. But one of the most overlooked ways that God speaks is through the stirring in your own spirit. That persistent thought that won't go away, that feeling deep inside you that something needs to change, that quiet conviction that keeps resurfacing no matter how much you try to ignore it, that is often the voice of God. He doesn't just place random desires in your heart. He doesn't stir you without purpose. When Jesus asks you a question, when he places something heavy on your soul, it's not just a passing thought, it's an invitation. And the more you ignore it, the more distant his voice seems to become. Think about Samuel. When God called him as a child, he didn't recognize the voice of the Lord at first. He thought it was Eli calling him in the night. It wasn't until Eli told him, "The next time you hear it, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening,'" that Samuel truly responded. And from that moment on, God began to reveal himself to him in ways he had never known before. That's the key. Not just hearing, but listening. Not just recognizing that God is speaking, but responding with readiness. How many times has Jesus been calling you, and you've mistaken his voice for something else? How many times has he stirred something in you, but you've dismissed it as just a fleeting thought? How many times has he asked you a question, and instead of answering, you've drowned it out with distractions, convincing yourself that you'll deal with it later? The problem is never that God has stopped speaking. It's that we have stopped listening. We have filled our minds with so many worries, so many voices, so much external noise that his voice gets buried beneath it all. And that is why recognizing his voice requires something that many people struggle with: stillness. True stillness. Not just physical silence, but an intentional quieting of the soul. In a world that is constantly demanding our attention, where every second is filled with notifications, entertainment, responsibilities, and endless distractions, taking the time to sit in God's presence and truly listen feels unnatural. But it is in those moments, in the quiet, in the stillness, that we begin to hear him more clearly. Maybe that's what he is calling you to do right now. Maybe he is asking, will you slow down enough to listen? Maybe he is prompting you to stop striving, to stop chasing after answers, and to simply be still in his presence. Because when you do, when you make space for his voice, when you tune out the distractions, you will realize that he has been speaking all along. The question is, are you ready to hear him? If this is resonating with you, if you know that Jesus has been calling you into a deeper awareness of his voice, I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I am listening." Let this be your response to his call today. The challenge: answering Jesus. Hearing the voice of Jesus is one thing. Answering him is something else entirely. Many people go through life longing for a divine encounter, waiting for a sign, hoping for direction. But when the moment actually arrives, when Jesus places a question in their heart, they hesitate. They hesitate because answering Jesus always requires something. It requires surrender, it requires trust, it requires the courage to step into the unknown. And that's why so many people choose to remain where they are, stuck between knowing what Jesus is asking of them and the fear of what saying yes will cost. The truth is, every time Jesus asked someone a question in the Bible, it was a moment of decision. It wasn't just about words, it was about action. When he asked Peter, "Do you love me?" it wasn't just about emotion, it was about responsibility. Peter's answer meant stepping into his calling, leading the church, and ultimately giving his life for the gospel. When Jesus asked the paralyzed man at the pool, "Do you want to be healed?" it wasn't just about physical restoration, it was about stepping into a new identity, one where he could no longer depend on his past excuses. When Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" it forced them to take a stand, to define their faith, to declare with certainty what they believed. Answering Jesus is never just about words, it's about what follows. And that's where the real battle happens. Because answering Jesus means leaving something behind. It means letting go of the version of yourself that is comfortable but unfulfilled, safe but stagnant, familiar but far from what God has actually called you to be. It means walking away from fear, from hesitation, from the lie that says you need to have everything figured out before you step forward. It means trusting that if Jesus is asking you something, it's not to confuse you, not to test you for no reason, but to lead you into something greater. But many people never answer. They wait. They wait for more clarity, for a bigger sign, for circumstances to align perfectly before they move. And in that waiting, the moment passes. The fire that was once burning in their spirit fades into hesitation, into doubt, into inaction. They convince themselves that they will answer later, that they will step into what God is calling them to when they feel ready. But the uncomfortable truth is this: if you're waiting to feel ready, you never will. Because faith is not about certainty. Faith is about stepping forward even when you don't have all the answers. Jesus is not looking for perfect responses. He is not waiting for you to have everything figured out. He is looking for willingness. He is looking for someone who, even in their uncertainty, is willing to say, "Yes, Lord." Someone who, even with fear in their heart, is willing to take the first step. Someone who, even when they don't fully understand the plan, is willing to trust the one who is calling them. And that is the challenge. That is where so many people get stuck, at the crossroads between hesitation and obedience, between fear and faith, between staying where they are and stepping into the unknown. But here's what you need to know: delayed obedience is still disobedience. The longer you wait to answer Jesus, the harder it becomes. The more you ignore his question, the quieter his voice feels. And before you know it, what once felt like a burning conviction becomes just a distant thought, something you push to the back of your mind, something you convince yourself wasn't that important after all. But what if you answered him today? What if instead of waiting for the perfect moment, you simply said yes? What if you trusted that if Jesus is asking, he has already made a way? What if you chose faith over fear, action over hesitation, obedience over comfort? Because the truth is, the greatest miracles, the greatest transformations, the greatest moments of breakthrough happen in the lives of those who are willing to respond to Jesus, even when they don't feel ready. And that's what I want you to do right now. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I say yes." Let this be your declaration. Let this be the moment you choose faith over fear. Let this be the moment you step into what he is calling you to. What happens when you answer? Something shifts in the spiritual realm the moment you answer Jesus. It's not just an internal decision. It's an act of faith that moves things in ways you can't yet see. Every person in the Bible who responded to Jesus with obedience experienced a transformation, sometimes immediately, sometimes over time, but always in a way that redefined their destiny. Because when you answer him, you're not just agreeing with a question, you're stepping into a new reality where his presence leads and his promises unfold. But that doesn't mean it will always be easy. Answering Jesus comes with change, and change often comes with resistance. When Peter answered Jesus and stepped out of the boat onto the water, his faith carried him for a moment, but then fear tried to pull him under. When Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and surrendered his life to him, his sight was taken for 3 days, as if God needed to shut out every distraction so Paul could truly see for the first time. When Abraham answered God's call to leave his homeland and step into the unknown, he had to walk in faith for years before he saw the promise fulfilled. Obedience doesn't always come with immediate rewards. Sometimes it comes with a season of testing, a process of refinement, a journey that forces you to rely on Jesus more than ever before. And that's where many people struggle. They expect that saying yes to Jesus will instantly remove every challenge, open every door, and eliminate every doubt. But faith doesn't work like that. Faith is tested. Faith is built in the moments when you don't have all the answers, when you don't see the outcome, when you are asked to keep walking even though you don't know where the road is leading. That's why so many people hesitate to fully commit. They want the security of knowing exactly what will happen before they say yes. But Jesus never gives guarantees. He gives invitations. He doesn't show you the whole path. He asks you to trust him one step at a time. And when you do, something incredible happens. You begin to see evidence of his hand in places you never noticed before. Doors start to open that you didn't even knock on. Strength rises up inside you that you didn't know you had. You begin to move differently, to think differently, to desire things you never thought you would. Because when you answer Jesus, you are no longer walking according to your own understanding. You are walking in alignment with something greater, something eternal, something that carries divine purpose. And that's when real transformation begins. But not everyone experiences this. Not because Jesus doesn't move, but because many people answer halfway. They say yes with their mouths, but hold back in their hearts. They step forward but keep looking over their shoulders at what they left behind. They want to follow Jesus, but they also want to stay in control. And as long as that battle exists, they will never fully step into what he has for them. That's why the disciples had to leave everything behind. That's why Peter had to drop his nets. Why Matthew had to walk away from his tax booth. Why Elisha had to burn his plows before following Elijah. Because partial obedience is still disobedience. A half-hearted yes is still hesitation. Jesus isn't looking for people who respond with conditions. He is looking for people who say that, Lord, whatever it takes, I'm yours. So now the question isn't just whether you will answer Jesus. It's how you will answer him. Will you respond with hesitation or with surrender? Will you follow with one foot in and one foot out? Or will you step fully into the life he is calling you to? Because the truth is, the way you answer will determine what happens next. And if you are ready, if you are truly willing to step into all that God has for you, then declare it now. Write in the comments, Jesus, I surrender completely. Let this be the moment you step into the fullness of his calling, the cost of surrendering completely. Saying, Jesus, I surrender completely, is more than just a declaration. It's a commitment that will redefine everything in your life. Because true surrender isn't partial. It's not giving up some things while holding on to others. It's not trusting God in the areas where you feel comfortable while keeping control in the places where you feel vulnerable. Real surrender is full, absolute, and without conditions. It's placing your plans, your fears, your desires, and your entire identity in his hands, trusting that whatever he does with them will be better than anything you could have done on your own. And that kind of surrender comes with a cost. It's dying to pride, breaking free from habits that once defined you, letting go of the need for control, and embracing the uncomfortable reality that faith often requires you to step into the unknown with nothing but trust. Jesus never hid the fact that following him would cost something. He told his disciples plainly, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Matthew 16:24. That statement wasn't just metaphorical, it was literal. In their world, the cross wasn't a symbol of hope or redemption yet. It was a symbol of execution, of suffering, of complete surrender. Jesus was making it clear that following him wouldn't be easy. It would require sacrifice. It would mean letting go of personal ambitions, of comfort, of anything that stood in the way of full devotion to God. And he wasn't just speaking to the 12 disciples. He was speaking to every person who would ever hear his call and have to decide if the cost was worth it. And that is where many people struggle. They love the idea of Jesus as Savior, but they hesitate when it comes to making him Lord. They want his blessings, but they don't want to let go of their own will. They want his peace, but they resist his authority. They want to walk in his purpose, but they are afraid of what they might have to leave behind. So they hold back. They give God pieces of their life, but never everything. They surrender only in the areas that feel safe, while keeping certain doors locked, unwilling to let him in completely. And as long as that resistance exists, they will never experience the fullness of what he has for them. Because here is the reality. Whatever you refuse to surrender will eventually control you. If you refuse to surrender your fears, they will dictate your decisions. If you refuse to surrender your past, it will define your future. If you refuse to surrender your relationships, they will shape your identity more than God's truth. If you refuse to surrender your plans, you will always wonder if you are missing out on something greater. Jesus doesn't ask for surrender because he wants to take something away. He asks for surrender because he wants to free you from the things that are holding you back. And that's the real cost of surrender. Not just what you have to give up, but what you gain when you finally let go. Because the moment you stop resisting, the moment you place everything in his hands, the moment you say, Jesus, whatever you want, I trust you, that's when the weight lifts. That's when peace replaces anxiety, when clarity replaces confusion, when strength rises where there was once fear. That's when you begin to step into a life that is not just yours, but his, fully led by the one who knows you better than you know yourself. So now, you have a choice. You can hold on to control, keep one foot in and one foot out, stay where it feels comfortable but never truly experience the power of full surrender. Or you can take the step that changes everything. You can surrender completely, without conditions, without hesitation, without looking back. And if you are ready to take that step, I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, Jesus, I surrender everything to you. Let this be the moment you choose faith over fear, trust over control, surrender over hesitation, breaking the barriers that hold you back. Surrendering completely to Jesus is the most freeing yet terrifying decision you will ever make. It is an invitation into the unknown, into a life that no longer belongs to you, but is fully guided by him. And even though the desire to surrender may be burning in your heart, there are often invisible barriers holding you back, keeping you from stepping fully into what God has for you. These barriers are not always obvious. They don't always look like outright rebellion or rejection of God's will. Sometimes they are subtle, disguised as logic, disguised as waiting for the right time, disguised as needing more confirmation. But in reality, they are fear, doubt, and resistance wrapped in excuses that feel reasonable. One of the greatest barriers to surrender is the fear of losing control. Human nature craves certainty. We want to know what will happen next. We want guarantees. We want the security of having a backup plan in case things don't go the way we expect. But surrender requires the opposite. It requires walking into the unknown, trusting that even when you can't see what's ahead, God already has the path laid out. It requires believing that even if everything doesn't make sense right now, he is orchestrating something far greater than you could ever imagine. And that is uncomfortable. It goes against everything the world teaches about success, stability, and planning for the future. The world says, take control of your destiny. Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. The world says, make things happen on your own terms. Jesus says, trust me with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. These two perspectives will always be in conflict, and you have to decide which voice you will follow. Another major barrier is the fear of failure. Many people hesitate to fully surrender to Jesus because they are afraid they will fall short, that they won't be strong enough to maintain their faith, that they will disappoint God. But that fear is a lie. Jesus never called perfect people. He never expected flawless obedience. He called fishermen, tax collectors, outcasts, people who had weaknesses, people who made mistakes, people who doubted even when they were standing right in front of him. And yet, he still chose them. Because God does not need you to be perfect, he needs you to be willing. The enemy wants you to believe that you need to have everything figured out before you can say yes to God. But Jesus is not asking for your perfection. He is asking for your heart. Then there is the barrier of past wounds. Some people struggle to surrender to Jesus because they have been hurt before. Hurt by people, hurt by broken promises, hurt by disappointments that made them question whether trusting fully in God is even safe. Maybe you've prayed for something that didn't happen the way you expected. Maybe you've stepped out in faith before and felt like you were met with silence. Maybe you've seen people misuse the name of God and now you're hesitant to trust him fully. If that's you, know this. God is not like people. His plans are not built on human failure. His faithfulness is not based on circumstances. Even when you don't understand what he is doing, even when your heart has been broken by situations you never expected, he is still good. He is still working. He is still calling you closer. And surrendering to him doesn't mean pretending the pain isn't real. It means allowing him to heal it, to redeem it, to use even the broken pieces of your life for something beautiful. And then there is the final barrier, the fear of change. Because let's be honest, surrendering to Jesus means things will change. It means your priorities will shift. It means some relationships will not survive the transformation. It means the things that used to bring you comfort may no longer fit in your life, and that is unsettling. Because even when we know God is leading us to something better, there is a part of us that clings to what is familiar, even when what is familiar is the very thing keeping us from our purpose. But the truth is, you cannot step into the fullness of what God has for you while still holding on to the things He is asking you to leave behind. Every person in the Bible who truly followed God had to let go of something. Abraham had to leave his homeland. Moses had to leave his position of comfort in Pharaoh's palace. Peter had to leave his boat. Paul had to leave his old identity behind, not because God wanted to take things away from them, but because He had something far greater to give them. And now, it's your turn. What is holding you back from fully surrendering to Jesus? What is the barrier standing between you and the life God is calling you to live? You don't have to fight this battle alone. You don't have to have all the answers right now, but you do have to take a step. And I want you to take that step today. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I let go of everything that holds me back." Let this be the moment you break free from fear, from doubt, from hesitation, and step fully into what God has for you. Stepping into a life of obedience. Letting go of everything that holds you back is just the beginning. Surrender is not a one-time decision. It is a daily commitment to walk in obedience, to trust God in every step, even when the path is unclear. Many people think that once they surrender, everything will immediately fall into place, that doors will open instantly, that clarity will come like a flood. But true obedience is tested in the moments when nothing seems to be happening, when faith is required not just for the big steps, but for the small, unseen ones. Walking in obedience means choosing to follow Jesus even when it feels inconvenient, even when it requires patience, even when it goes against what the world considers logical. It is not a journey of shortcuts or easy answers. It is a journey of trust, one that requires endurance, consistency, and a willingness to keep moving forward, even when you don't yet see the results. Obedience begins in the unseen places, in the quiet moments where no one is watching, in the decisions that seem small but carry great weight in the spiritual realm. It's in the way you choose to respond when God nudges your heart, in the way you handle situations where you could take the easy way out but instead choose integrity. It's in the way you prioritize time with Him, in the way you listen when He speaks, in the way you act on His word instead of just hearing it and moving on. Many people struggle with obedience because they think it has to come with a grand, dramatic moment where everything changes at once. But obedience is often a series of small, daily choices that shape your character and prepare you for the bigger steps of faith. And this is where so many people hesitate. They think they need to have everything figured out before they start walking. They wait for full clarity, for the perfect conditions, for a sign so unmistakable that it removes every ounce of doubt. But that's not how faith works. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland and go to a place that He would show him. Not a place that was already revealed, not a mapped-out destination, but a land that would only be shown once Abraham started walking. That is the nature of obedience. It requires movement before certainty, trust before full understanding. If you are waiting for God to lay out every detail before you take the first step, you may end up waiting forever. The hardest part of obedience is often the in-between, the time between the step of faith and the fulfillment of the promise. This is where people start to question if they heard God correctly. This is where doubt creeps in, where impatience takes over, where people are tempted to turn back because they don't see immediate results. But faith is about perseverance. It's about trusting that if God called you to something, He is faithful to bring it to completion. It's about holding on to His word, even when circumstances seem to contradict what He promised. This is why so many people never reach the fullness of what God has for them. Not because He didn't have a plan, but because they gave up too soon. They let discouragement pull them away. They let fear silence their obedience. They let the waiting convince them that maybe they got it wrong. But what if the breakthrough is just ahead? What if the fulfillment of the promise is closer than you think, but you need to keep walking to reach it? Think about Joshua and the Israelites walking around the walls of Jericho. God told them to march, to keep moving even when nothing was happening, to trust that on the seventh day the walls would fall. But imagine if they had stopped on the sixth day. Imagine if they had looked at the walls and said, "This isn't working. We must have misunderstood. Let's turn back." they would have walked away from a victory that was already theirs, simply because they didn't see immediate results. How many people do that today? How many give up just before the miracle, just before the breakthrough, just before the moment God was about to move? This is why obedience is about endurance. It is about moving even when you don't feel like it, about trusting even when you don't see results, about continuing to walk even when everything in you wants to stop. Because every step of obedience is building something, shaping something, preparing something that you cannot yet see. The process is just as important as the promise. The waiting is just as valuable as the fulfillment. Because in the waiting, God is refining you, strengthening you, teaching you to rely on Him in ways that comfort and certainty never could. So now, the question is, will you keep walking? Will you stay obedient even when the walls haven't fallen yet? Even when the promise hasn't been fulfilled yet? Even when you don't see the outcome yet? Because that is what true faith looks like. And if you are ready to take that step, if you are ready to walk in obedience no matter what, I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, Jesus, I will walk in obedience. Let this be your commitment, your declaration, your moment of faith. Trusting God when the path isn't clear. Walking in obedience is one thing when everything is unfolding the way you expect, when you see progress, when you feel like you're moving toward something tangible. But what about when the path isn't clear? What about when you take a step of faith only to be met with silence? What about when you obey, but nothing seems to change? This is where many people start to struggle, where doubt creeps in, where the temptation to turn back becomes overwhelming. Because in our human nature we crave certainty. We want to know exactly where God is leading us, exactly how things will unfold, exactly when the answers will come. But faith doesn't work like that. Trusting God means believing in His plan even when you can't see the full picture, even when it feels like nothing is happening, even when every part of you wants to take control. The Bible is filled with moments where God called people to trust Him before revealing the next step. Think about Noah. God told him to build an ark when there was no rain, no flood, no sign of disaster. He spent years constructing something that must have seemed foolish to everyone around him. People probably mocked him, questioned his sanity, tried to convince him that he was wasting his time. And yet Noah kept building. He kept obeying, because he trusted that if God had spoken, the promise would come to pass, even if he couldn't see it yet. That kind of trust is rare. That kind of faith is what separates those who step into the fullness of God's plan from those who hesitate and miss what He is doing. Then there's Joseph. God gave him dreams of greatness, visions of leadership, glimpses of a future where he would be in a position of power. But what happened next? Betrayal, slavery, false accusations, prison. Everything in Joseph's life seemed to be moving in the opposite direction of what God had promised. Imagine the confusion, the frustration, the questions he must have had. God, did I hear you wrong? Was the dream real? Why does it feel like you have abandoned me? And yet, Joseph remained faithful. He trusted even when nothing made sense. He held on to the vision even when circumstances seemed to contradict it. And in time, the promise was fulfilled. But it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen the way he expected. It happened through a process, a journey that required faith in the unseen, trust in the waiting, and obedience even when it felt like nothing was changing. And that's exactly where many people are today. They start off strong, full of faith, ready to follow Jesus with all their heart. But then the waiting begins. Then the obstacles appear. Then the silence stretches on longer than they expected. And little by little, they start to doubt. They start to wonder if they misheard God, if they made a mistake, if maybe they should just take matters into their own hands. And that is the moment of decision. That is the moment that determines everything. Because trusting God when you have all the answers is easy. But trusting Him when you don't, when the path is unclear, when everything in you wants to take control, that is where real faith is tested. This is why so many people never step into the fullness of what God has for them. Not because God didn't have a plan, not because He wasn't faithful, but because they gave up too soon. They let discouragement win. They let fear dictate their decisions. They let the uncertainty convince them that maybe they should just return to what feels safe. But what if the breakthrough is just ahead? What if God is testing your trust, refining your faith, preparing you for something greater than you could ever imagine? What if you are closer than you think, but the only way to reach it is to keep going, to keep trusting, to keep believing even when you don't see the outcome yet? Think about the Israelites at the Red Sea. God had just delivered them from Egypt, just performed miracle after miracle, just demonstrated his power in ways they had never seen before. And yet, the moment they faced an obstacle, the moment the sea stood before them and Pharaoh's army was behind them, they panicked, they doubted, they started to question if they had made a mistake in leaving Egypt. But God had a plan, a way they couldn't see, a path that had not yet been revealed. And when the time was right, the waters parted, and they walked through on dry ground. But what if they had turned back before the miracle happened? What if they had let fear keep them from stepping forward? That is the challenge of trusting God when the path isn't clear. It is choosing to believe that He is working even when you don't see it. It is choosing to keep moving forward, even when it feels like nothing is happening. It is choosing to surrender your need for control and trust that His timing, His way, His plan is always better than yours. And now, you have that choice. You can let fear keep you stuck, or you can take a step of faith, even in the unknown. If you are ready to trust God no matter what, I want you to declare it right now. Write in the comments, "Jesus, I trust you even when I can't see." Let this be your declaration of faith, your commitment to keep moving forward, no matter what. When faith requires waiting. Trusting God when the path isn't clear is one of the greatest tests of faith. But what happens when the path isn't just unclear? It's still closed. What do you do when God calls you to something? When you've stepped out in obedience, but instead of immediate breakthrough, you find yourself in a season of waiting? This is where many people struggle the most. Not in the initial step of faith, not in the moment of surrender, but in the waiting that follows. The time between the promise and its fulfillment. The silence between the prayer and the answer. The space where doubt has the opportunity to creep in and whisper, "Did God really say that? Did I make a mistake? Is anything actually happening?" Waiting is one of the hardest things for human nature to accept because it requires patience, endurance, and trust in something we cannot see. In a world that values instant gratification, waiting feels like wasted time. We want results now, answers now, movement now. But in God's kingdom, waiting is never wasted. It is in the waiting that faith is refined. It is in the waiting that trust is strengthened. It is in the waiting that God does the deep, unseen work in us that is necessary for what comes next. Because here is the truth. Many people want the promise, but they don't want the process. They want the victory, but they don't want the preparation. They want the open door, but they don't want the patience required to walk through it at the right time. Think about David, anointed as king when he was still a shepherd boy, yet he didn't take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years in obscurity, years running from Saul, years wondering when the promise would finally come to pass. He could have forced his way into kingship. He had opportunities to take matters into his own hands, but he chose to wait on God's timing. And in that waiting, God shaped him into the king he was meant to be. If David had rushed ahead, if he had tried to take the throne in his own strength, he would not have been ready. The waiting wasn't a punishment, it was preparation. Then there's Joseph, given dreams of greatness as a teenager, but instead of stepping directly into leadership, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Year after year passed with no sign of the promise being fulfilled. But what Joseph couldn't see was that every challenge, every delay, every seemingly unfair situation was positioning him for the exact moment when he would rise to power. If he had given up in the waiting, if he had let frustration and disappointment harden his heart, he never would have stepped into his destiny. And then we look at Jesus. Even the Son of God had a season of waiting before stepping fully into his mission. 30 years of preparation for 3 years of ministry. He waited because there was an appointed time, a divine moment when everything would align. And when that moment came, he stepped forward in full authority, ready for what he had been called to do. So what about you? Maybe you are in a season of waiting right now. Maybe you have prayed, you have obeyed, you have trusted, but nothing seems to be happening. Maybe it feels like doors remain closed, like the promise is still distant, like you are stuck in a cycle of uncertainty. But what if the waiting is not a delay? What if it is part of the plan? What if God is using this time to refine you, to strengthen you, to prepare you for what you cannot yet see? Because here's what you need to understand. God's timing is not just about the right moment. It's about making sure you are ready for the moment when it arrives. Many people give up in the waiting. They let impatience lead them into decisions they were never meant to make. They force opportunities that were never meant for them. They settle for less because they don't want to endure the process. Those who trust his timing, those who refuse to take shortcuts, those are the ones who step into the fullness of his promises. Because when God finally moves, he moves suddenly. What took years of preparation can change in an instant when the time is right. And so the question is, can you trust him even in the waiting? Can you hold on to his promise even when it feels like nothing is happening? Can you stay faithful even when you don't see results? Because those who wait on the Lord will see his faithfulness in ways they never imagined. And if you are in that season right now, if you are waiting for something God has promised, I want you to declare it. Write in the comments, God, I will wait on your timing. Let this be your act of faith, your statement of trust, your commitment to believe that his plan is always worth the wait. When waiting feels like silence, there is something about waiting that tests a person's heart in a way nothing else does. It is one thing to trust God when you can see signs of movement, when there are little confirmations along the way, when you feel his presence guiding you step by step. But what about when all you hear is silence? What about when you have been praying, seeking, surrendering, and yet heaven seems quiet? This is where faith is stretched, where trust is refined, where many people start to question if God is even listening. Because silence can feel like abandonment. It can feel like rejection. It can feel like maybe, just maybe, you got it all wrong. And this is where so many people walk away, not because they don't love God, but because they don't know how to handle the silence. But what if silence isn't a sign of God's absence, but rather a test of your faith? What if the silence is actually part of his process, a space where he is working in ways you cannot yet see? The Bible is filled with moments where God seemed silent, but in reality, he was setting the stage for something greater. Think about Job, a man who was righteous, faithful, devoted to God, and yet when trials came, when everything was taken from him, God didn't immediately respond. Job cried out, asked for answers, wrestled with his suffering, and for a long time, heaven remained quiet. But was God absent? No. He was watching. He was allowing Job's faith to be tested, to be refined, to go through the fire so that in the end, Job would come out stronger, wiser, and more blessed than before. Then there's the story of Lazarus. When Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that their brother was sick, they expected him to come immediately. They had seen his miracles. They knew his power. They believed he could heal. But Jesus did something unexpected. He waited. He delayed his response. And in that waiting, Lazarus died. Can you imagine how Mary and Martha must have felt? Abandoned, forgotten, hurt. They must have wondered why Jesus didn't come when they needed him most. But what they didn't realize was that Jesus was allowing a greater miracle to unfold. He wasn't just going to heal Lazarus, he was going to resurrect him. What felt like silence was actually divine strategy. And what about Jesus himself? Hanging on the cross, enduring the weight of the world's sin, feeling the full separation from the Father, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet, there was no immediate response. Heaven was silent. But did that mean the Father had abandoned him? No, the silence was temporary. The silence was part of the victory. 3 days later, the greatest miracle in history took place. This is what we often forget when we are in seasons of waiting. God's silence is not his absence. His delay is not his denial. His quietness does not mean he has forgotten you. It means he is working in ways you cannot yet perceive. It means he is preparing something greater than you imagined. It means he is stretching your faith, deepening your trust, teaching you to rely on him even when you don't feel him. Because true faith is not built in the moments when God is speaking loudly, when everything is falling into place, when doors are opening without resistance. True faith is built in the silence, in the waiting, in the times when you have no choice but to keep believing, even when nothing makes sense. But this is where the enemy attacks the most, because silence creates space for doubt. When God isn't speaking the way we expect, the enemy starts whispering lies. God doesn't care. He's forgotten you. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you're not worthy. Maybe you should stop waiting and take control yourself. And this is where so many people fall into spiritual exhaustion. They let the silence convince them that God isn't moving, that their prayers aren't making a difference, that maybe they should give up. But that is exactly what the enemy wants, because he knows that if he can get you to stop praying, to stop believing, to stop trusting, then he can keep you from the breakthrough that is coming. So what do you do when God is silent? You keep going. You keep worshiping. You keep praying. You keep trusting. You keep reminding yourself that just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. You hold on to His promises, even when you don't feel His presence. You declare His faithfulness, even when everything around you seems to contradict it. Because if there is one thing that Scripture proves over and over again, it's this: God always comes through. Always. The silence never lasts forever. The waiting is never wasted. The breakthrough always comes. And maybe right now you are in that place. Maybe you have been waiting for an answer, crying out for direction, pleading for God to move, and all you have been met with is silence. Maybe you are questioning if you can keep holding on, if you have the strength to continue believing. But let me tell you this: don't give up. You are closer than you think. God is not done. The story isn't over. The silence will break, and when it does, you will see that He was working all along. And if this is for you, if you know you are in a season of waiting but you refuse to let go of faith, I want you to declare it. Write in the comments, "God, I trust you even in the silence." Let this be your act of faith, your commitment to keep believing, your statement that no matter how long it takes, you will not stop trusting Him. When God's answer looks different than you expected. There comes a moment in every journey of faith when you realize that God's answer doesn't always look the way you imagined. You pray for direction, for breakthrough, for a door to open, and sometimes what God provides is completely different from what you expected. Maybe you were waiting for a clear yes, but instead you feel led in an entirely new direction. Maybe you were asking for an opportunity, but instead you face a closed door. Maybe you were expecting a miracle to happen instantly, but instead, God is taking you through a process. This is where many people struggle, not because God hasn't answered, but because His answer doesn't match their expectations. The hardest thing about faith is trusting that God's way is better, even when you don't understand it. We like to believe that if we pray hard enough, if we have enough faith, God will move exactly the way we want Him to. But faith is not about controlling God's response. It's about surrendering to His wisdom. And sometimes that means accepting that His plan is different from what we envisioned. Look at Moses. He thought delivering Israel from Egypt would be a simple, direct mission. Instead, he found himself leading a nation through the wilderness for 40 years. Look at Paul. He probably imagined spreading the gospel as a traveling preacher, yet much of his greatest work, the letters that would shape Christianity for generations, was written from a prison cell. Look at Mary and Martha. They wanted Jesus to heal their brother, but instead He let Lazarus die, only to resurrect him later and reveal a greater miracle than they had dared to believe. God's ways are higher than ours. His timing is different. His methods are beyond our understanding, and sometimes, His best answer comes in a form we never expected. That's why so many people get frustrated in their faith. They assume that a delay means denial, that a closed door means rejection, that silence means God isn't listening. But what if, instead of seeing these moments as disappointments, you saw them as divine redirection? What if the door that closed wasn't rejection but protection? What if the thing you thought was a failure was actually the setup for something greater? What if what seems like a delay is actually perfect timing? This is why trust is the foundation of faith, because God doesn't always explain Himself. He doesn't always give you the full picture before asking you to follow. He doesn't always reveal the outcome before requiring obedience. And that's hard. It's hard to keep believing when nothing is going according to plan. It's hard to keep moving forward when the road looks different than what you imagined. It's hard to surrender your expectations and embrace the unknown. But this is where faith becomes real. Faith is not about getting what you want from God. It's about trusting that what He gives you is what you actually need. Think about the Israelites standing before the Red Sea. They wanted a way out of Egypt, but they didn't expect it to come through a miraculous parting of the waters. Think about Gideon, who thought he needed a massive army to win his battle, but God reduced his soldiers to just 300 to prove that victory comes from Him alone. Think about Peter, who was expecting Jesus to establish an earthly kingdom, but instead, he watched Him go to the cross. Over and over again, God's ways defy human logic, but they always lead to something greater than what we could have planned for ourselves. Maybe right now, God's answer in your life looks different than you expected. Maybe you prayed for one thing, but He is leading you in another direction. Maybe you were asking for immediate breakthrough, but He is calling you to a season of growth instead. Maybe you were hoping for a smooth path, but He is refining your faith through trials. And in this moment, you have a choice. You can resist what He is doing because it doesn't fit your expectations, or you can trust that His way is higher, that His plan is perfect, that His answer, no matter how different it looks, is always good. God doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't get it wrong. He isn't confused about your future. If He is leading you a different way than you imagined, it's because He sees what you cannot see. He knows what is coming. He knows what is best. He knows what will bring you closer to His purpose. And if you trust Him, if you truly surrender, you will see that even the things you didn't understand were working together for your good. So now, the question is, will you trust God even when His answer is different than what you expected? If you are ready to surrender not just to His will, but to His way, I want you to declare it. Write in the comments, "God, I trust your plan over mine." Let this be your moment of faith, your statement of surrender, your declaration that no matter how things unfold, you believe that His way is always best. Trusting God's plan when it doesn't make sense. There comes a point in every journey of faith when you realize that God's plan isn't just different from your own, it is beyond your understanding. You pray, you wait, you surrender, and then, when God moves, it doesn't look anything like what you expected. The path you envisioned for your life suddenly shifts. The thing you thought would happen doesn't. The opportunity you believed was yours closes. The answer to your prayer arrives, but in a way that feels confusing, uncomfortable, even painful. And in that moment, you are faced with a choice. Will you trust God, even when His plan doesn't make sense? This is where many people struggle, not because they don't believe in God, but because they don't understand Him. They expect His ways to align with human logic, to follow a pattern that makes sense, to unfold in a way that is predictable and comfortable. But Scripture repeatedly shows us that God's ways are higher than ours, that His thoughts go beyond what we can comprehend, that His plans often require a level of trust that defies human reasoning. Think about Noah, who was called to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. Think about Joshua, who was told to march around Jericho's walls instead of attacking. Think about Gideon, who had his army reduced to just 300 men before going into battle. None of these instructions made sense in the moment, but they didn't have to, because they were God's plan, and that was enough. The same is true in your life. Maybe God is leading you in a direction that you didn't anticipate. Maybe He has closed a door you desperately wanted to walk through. Maybe He is asking you to step into something that feels bigger than you, something that requires more faith than you think you have, and your mind is wrestling with the uncertainty, trying to figure out how it will all come together, trying to make sense of what God is doing. But here's the truth. Faith is not about understanding. It is about obedience. You don't have to see the full picture to take the next step. You don't have to understand the destination to trust the one who is leading you. This is why so many people struggle in their faith. They want control. They want clarity before they commit. They want to see the entire plan before they step forward. But that's not how faith works. Faith is stepping into the unknown, believing that even if you don't understand, God does. It's walking through doors that don't make sense, trusting that they are leading you somewhere greater. It's surrendering the need to have all the answers and choosing instead to rest in the assurance that God's plan is always good, even when it doesn't feel good in the moment. Think about Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, of leadership, of influence. But before he stepped into that destiny, he went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. Imagine how many times he must have questioned God's plan. Imagine how often he must have wondered if he had misunderstood the vision. But what he couldn't see was that every setback was actually a setup. Every delay was positioning him exactly where he needed to be. And when the time was right, everything came together in a way that was far greater than what Joseph could have imagined. Or look at the disciples. They followed Jesus, believing He was going to establish His kingdom in a way that made sense to them. They expected political power, earthly victory, immediate transformation. And then, instead of a throne, they saw Him nailed to a cross. Imagine their confusion, their disappointment, their heartbreak. They thought everything was falling apart, but in reality, everything was falling into place. The greatest victory in history was happening right in front of them, but they couldn't see it yet, because sometimes what looks like the end is actually the beginning of something greater. And maybe that is where you are right now. Maybe you are looking at your situation and struggling to understand why God is leading you this way. Maybe you are questioning why things aren't happening the way you expected. Maybe you feel like God's plan is taking you in the opposite direction of where you thought you were supposed to go. But let me remind you, just because you don't understand it, doesn't mean it isn't God. Just because it doesn't look the way you imagined, doesn't mean it isn't leading you exactly where you need to be. God is not asking you to understand. He is asking you to trust. He is asking you to keep walking even when the road doesn't make sense. He is asking you to surrender not just your plans, but your expectations of how things should unfold. Because when you let go of your need to control the process, you free yourself to fully embrace His purpose. And if you are in that place right now, if you know God is leading you but it doesn't make sense yet, I want you to declare it. Write in the comments, "God, I trust you even when I don't understand." Let this be your statement of faith, your surrender, your commitment to follow Him no matter what. When God's plan requires letting go, one of the hardest parts of trusting God is realizing that His plan will often require you to let go of things you never expected to release. It could be a relationship, an opportunity, a dream you've held on to for years. Sometimes it's an identity you've built for yourself, a version of your life that you thought was secure. But when God is leading you somewhere new, there will always be things that cannot go with you, not because He wants to take something from you, but because He wants to make room for something greater. The problem is, most people struggle with this moment. They want God's plan, but they also want to hold on to everything familiar. They want the new, but they fear the unknown. They pray for open doors, but they hesitate when God asks them to close some behind them. Letting go is never easy, because it requires trust at the deepest level. It's one thing to trust God when He is adding to your life, when blessings are pouring in, when everything is aligning the way you hoped. But what about when trusting Him means releasing something you love? What about when obedience looks like walking away from something good without fully knowing what's next? This is where faith is tested. This is where many people hesitate, holding on to something that is no longer part of God's plan for them, afraid that if they let go, they will be left with nothing. But the truth is, you will never lose something in obedience that God won't replace with something better in His time. Think about Abraham. He waited for years for the promise of a son, and then one day God asked him to lay Isaac on the altar. That request didn't make sense. It went against everything Abraham understood. But Abraham knew one thing: God is faithful. He knew that even if he had to let go of what he loved most, God would not fail him. And in the moment of his surrender, God provided. That's what surrender does. It opens the door for divine provision, for unexpected blessings, for a greater fulfillment of God's plan than you could have imagined. But you will never see it if you refuse to let go. This is why so many people feel stuck in their faith. They say they are waiting on God, but in reality, God is waiting on them to release what they are holding on to. They pray for direction, but they resist when God starts leading them away from what feels comfortable. They want new things, but they don't want to give up the old. And because of that, they stay in the same place, wondering why nothing is changing. But the truth is, you cannot step into what God has for you while still holding on to what He is asking you to leave behind. Think about the Israelites. God had promised them the promised land, a place of abundance, a future better than anything they had known. But before they could step into it, they had to leave Egypt. They had to walk away from the only life they had ever known. Even though it was a life of slavery, it was familiar. It was predictable. And when things got difficult in the wilderness, many of them wanted to go back. That is what happens when we hold on to the past. We romanticize it. We convince ourselves that what we had before was better, even when we know it wasn't. But God never calls us backward. His plan always moves us forward. And the only way to step into it is to trust Him enough to let go of everything that is not meant to come with us. Letting go is not just about people or circumstances. Sometimes God calls you to let go of mindsets that no longer serve you. Maybe He is asking you to release the fear that has kept you from taking bold steps of faith. Maybe He is asking you to let go of the doubt that whispers, "What if God doesn't come through?" Maybe He is asking you to stop holding on to past failures, past disappointments, past seasons where things didn't work out the way you hoped. Because the truth is, if you are still defining your future by what happened in your past, you will never fully embrace what God has ahead of you. So what is God asking you to release? What have you been holding on to, afraid that if you let go you will lose control? Because here is the truth: you are not in control anyway. Holding on to something out of fear does not give you security. It only keeps you from stepping into something greater. Letting go is scary. It requires faith. It requires trust. It requires believing that even if you don't understand why God is asking you to release something, He knows exactly what He is doing. And maybe that's the step you need to take today. Maybe you have been praying for answers, but what God is really asking from you is surrender. Maybe you have been waiting for a sign, And this is it. If you know God is calling you to let go of something, if you know there is something in your life that you have been holding onto out of fear, I want you to declare it today. Write in the comments, God, I trust you enough to let go. Let this be your moment of release, your act of surrender, your step into the future God has for you, the freedom that comes with letting go. There is a moment in every journey of faith when you realize that the things you were so afraid to release were never meant to hold you in the first place. Letting go isn't just about sacrifice, it's about stepping into a greater level of freedom, a deeper trust in God, a release from the weight of trying to control things that were never yours to carry. So many people resist this process because they believe that letting go means losing something valuable. But the truth is, when God asks you to let go, He is never asking you to walk away empty-handed. He is asking you to make room for what He has prepared for you. And the moment you surrender, the moment you truly release everything into His hands, you begin to experience the kind of peace, clarity, and confidence that can only come from knowing that your life is fully in His control. One of the greatest lies people believe is that holding on to something gives them security, that if they just grip tighter, fight harder, cling with all their strength, they can keep things from slipping away. But the reality is, control is an illusion. No matter how much you try to hold on, there are things in life that are simply beyond your power, and the more you try to control, the more you end up exhausting yourself, anxious, frustrated, and discouraged. Because deep down, you know that no amount of effort can guarantee an outcome. You cannot force people to stay in your life. You cannot manipulate circumstances to work in your favor. You cannot make things happen just because you want them to. And the more you try, the heavier the burden becomes. That's why so many people are tired, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally. They are carrying things they were never meant to carry, holding on to things that God has been asking them to release, afraid that if they let go, everything will fall apart. But here is what happens when you finally surrender. You experience freedom, the kind of freedom that allows you to breathe again, to walk in peace, to move forward without fear. Because when you let go, you are no longer trying to control everything. You are trusting the one who already has everything under control. That's what Jesus meant when He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. He wasn't just talking about physical rest. He was talking about the rest that comes from fully trusting God, from laying down the weight of control, from believing that His plan is better than anything you could orchestrate on your own. Think about Peter when he was fishing all night and caught nothing. He had tried everything, used all his skill, done everything he knew how to do, but the nets remained empty. And then Jesus told him to cast the nets again, but this time to do it differently, to trust in His word instead of relying on his own understanding. Peter could have resisted. He could have argued that he had already tried. He could have held on to his own logic, his own experience, his own way of doing things. But instead, he let go of control. He obeyed. He surrendered to Jesus' instruction. And what happened? His nets were filled beyond capacity. That's what happens when you stop fighting to do things your way and start trusting that God's way is always better. So many people are standing at that same point in their own lives. They have been fighting, striving, exhausting themselves trying to make things work, but their nets remain empty. They have been holding on to plans, relationships, dreams, identities, afraid that if they let go, they will be left with nothing. But what if instead of clinging tighter, you surrendered? What if you trusted that when God asks you to release something, it's because He is preparing to fill your life with something greater? What if you believed that letting go isn't about losing, but about making space for what is truly meant for you? This is what true faith looks like. It is not just about believing in God. It is about trusting Him enough to release everything into His hands. It is about letting go of fear, of doubt, of the need to control outcomes. It is about walking forward without needing to have all the answers, without needing to see the whole picture, without needing to know exactly how everything will unfold. Because real trust says, God, even if I don't understand, I know you do. Even if I can't see the next step, I believe you are guiding me. Even if I have to release things that feel important to me, I trust that what you have for me is even greater. And maybe that is exactly where you are right now. Maybe you have been feeling that nudge in your spirit, that whisper from God telling you it's time to let go, but you've been afraid. Maybe you have convinced yourself that holding on is the safer choice. But let me tell you this, the safest place you can be is in full surrender to God, because He will never leave you empty. He will never ask you to release something without the intention of filling your hands with something even better, but you will never see it until you take that step of faith. If this is speaking to you, if you know there is something in your life that God has been asking you to release, I want you to take action right now. Write in the comments, "God, I let go and trust you." Let this be your declaration, your act of faith, your moment of surrender, because the moment you let go, you will step into the freedom that only He can give. If you have made it this far, it means that God has been speaking to your heart through this message. This is not just another video. This is a divine moment, a calling, a confirmation that He is working in your life. We don't believe in coincidences. If you are here, it is because God wanted you to hear this today. And now we want to know, how did this message speak to you? Take a moment to share your experience in the comments. Write, "I felt God's voice in this video," and tell us how this word touched your heart. Your testimony is powerful, and it might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And before you go, don't forget to be part of this mission. Subscribe to the channel, so you never miss another message that strengthens your faith and draws you closer to God's plan. Leave a like to show your support and help this message reach more lives. And most importantly, watch the next video that's on your screen right now, because what God has started in you today, He wants to continue revealing. May the Lord bless you abundantly, strengthen your heart, and guide you in every step of your journey. Keep believing, keep trusting, and remember, God's plan is always greater than what you can see.